Southern epistemologies, and initiatives that highlight the importance of teachings from grassroots resistance and soil-centered movements, including Black, Indigenous, landless, peasant, and Quilombola struggles. There's an emphasis on the knowledge of women and the reduction of gender, racial, and sexual violence, and of vulnerabilities produced by intersectional systems of oppression. The EarthCare framework offers guidance for developing learning experiences that can challenge narrowly imagined ideas of the public good, critically evaluate dominant practices and flows of knowledge production, and cultivate an appreciation for the gifts of multiple epistemic traditions, especially indigenous knowledge systems, resist paternalistic notions of progress and development, foster reflexivity through an awareness of the complexities, complicities, difficulties, and paradoxes of doing this work, cultivate, develop, and disseminate practices and skills that build various aspects of alternative presence and futures around food, architecture, energy, media, waste, etc., and build a global alliance of people and communities with both the passion, wisdom, and humility to confront complex social crises by advancing integrative justice. So, no, not this one. The other ones are there for if you have any questions, but a lot of this work is available on the Decolonial Futures website. This is an incubator website, so it's not a scaling up website. So we're not promoting it. Okay, everybody go there. Because what the artists, activists, and educators do, they put the work that is in draft form on the website for the collective to look at, but it's also available to a public. It's just not disseminated as a fully fledged, I think, project. But if you want to have a look, there's a lot there that is in the incubator, and a lot of the text that I read, not a lot actually, this is a new text, but a lot of the ideas that are in the text are also in this recent article that was published by the collective. And I think that's it. Thank you. Should I sit down? Okay.
Thanks so much for that, Vanessa. And again, the bios are already out there, you would have seen. So are we ready to launch Professor Mazawi coming to you all the way from Toronto?
Thank you. Thank you, Handel, and greetings everyone there. I can see myself, but I can't see the audience, so it's great actually, because it allows me to calibrate the time as well. Anyway, I would like to start recognize that it has not been an easy project to contribute to this panel, for the reasons that I think were touched upon by some of the speakers of the first panel about the standing right of people to invoke the colonial when they are inscribed in this process. And over my 16 years at UBC, I think this was a major highlight for me to understand that scholarship and knowledge are part of this larger process of colonizing that we need to recognize and start with. In this presentation, what I would like to do is to problematize the calls that we hear too often to decolonize higher educational institutions. And by reflecting on the specific case of Palestinian higher education institutions, institutions that are in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. I'll try to show it in a minute. Here we go. We have here, just to situate things, I think, the map along the Mediterranean provide the West Bank, on the left, the Gaza Strip. And what I'd like to say, just hearing myself, and what I would like to say is that I'm going to be talking about higher education institutions in those two areas. Cover about 1,000 square kilometers 1/5 of the lower mainland in Vancouver, lower mainland, with the Gaza Strip being completely sealed off for the last 10 years, with nobody going in and out. And as the West Bank area shows as well, Palestinian control or sovereignty is being reduced to kinds of bunker states, mainly organized around the big cities of Ramallah and Hebron. So that's basically the context I'm going to be talking about. Now I stop sharing. And let me say that that part of my interest as well is because I find it a little bit interesting in relation to the decolonial literature that I've been reading. And particularly the fact that, for example, Annibal Quijano makes in some of his writings, in which he basically distinguishes, and I agree with this distinction between colonialism in its sheer form of power and domination, and between coloniality, which he sees as the most prevalent one today, the form of domination, with colonialism having been largely what he says, quote unquote, destroyed. I find Quijano's distinction between colonialism and coloniality important, notwithstanding for him these two modalities of domination play out sequentially, reflecting in fact a historically situated periodization of the colonial. Such a construction of the colonial imposes two serious implications for decolonial theory and praxis. First, such a sequential construction of the colonial flattens contextual complexities, and it also reifines the multifaceted manifestations of the colonial across time and space. Secondly, decolonial work, by this distinction in the way it is constructed sequentially, reduces decolonial work to a narrow template of action that could be applied anywhere in the world. So in this presentation, what I would like to do is to actually capitalize on the context of Palestinian higher education institutions in the West Bank and Gaza Strip in order to a little bit propose a different view of this. And view.
Andrew, we can't hear you. Yeah. Okay. Now we can hear.
What I would like to propose is to approach this distinction between colonialism and coloniality not as sequential as Quijano offers or proposes, but as operating contemporaneously, and that they are both interwoven recursively in any moment of time, and that I would like to use the context of the Palestinian higher education institution to show how this imbrication of colonization or colonialism and coloniality operates in relation to this institution. And I will be doing that by addressing basically three questions or three aspects of this problematic. First, I would like to discuss the ways in which colonialism and coloniality of power that Quijano talks about operate contemporaneously as the major contextual determinants affecting Palestinian higher education institutions. Secondly, I would like to discuss how interlocking systems of power, which operate within Palestinian society, interface and intersect with the effects of colonialism, Israeli colonialism, amplifying the subjugating effects of the coloniality of power within Palestinian society. Thirdly, I would like to move to discuss how Palestinian higher education institutions are further impacted by the geopolitics of knowledge, given global capitalism, globalization, the spread of neoliberal approach to university, etc., and show how this third layer adds its own complexity. At the end, I will try to identify a few principles regarding what does it mean or what does it take to think about decolonial work within the Palestinian context. So I will start by saying that close to 5 million Palestinians currently live in the Israeli-occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. subjected to an Israeli colonial military regime, as one would have found it classically in different contexts, 19th and 20th century. Deprived of basic human rights, stateless, Palestinians are barred from organizing themselves under any form of legitimate government, while being systematically dispossessed of their land and dignity as individuals and as a community. Due to intensive Israeli settlement, land grabs, Palestinians, in fact, currently inhabit non-contiguous kinds of bantustans of sorts, spatially fragmented, ghetto, and dislocated territories. They lack control over the economy, labor market, labor resources, land resources, and any prospect of development. This applies, I would argue as well, even more to the Gaza Strip that has been under Israeli blockade for the last more than 10 years now. It is within these material and political realities, as the iron box of subjugation, that Palestinian institutions of higher education find themselves locked in. The majority of these institutions emerged after 1967, in the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, basically as grassroots organizations funded by private money, international donations, basically outside the frame of any kind of state system. It wasn't until the mid-1990s, after the formation of the Palestinian Authority, that a Palestinian Council of Higher Education was founded, and therefore universities became under the jurisdiction of this panel or this body, while at the same time remaining under the jurisdiction of Israeli military law. So we are talking basically about sheer or plain colonialism in that sense. The impact of Israeli occupation on the development and operation of Palestinian higher education institutions remains overwhelming. Limitations on the freedom of movement within and between each of the West Bank and Gaza Strip represent a core impediment, barring or complicating movements, collaborations, recruitment, and exchanges between institutions in the West Bank and Gaza Strip and between them and international organizations. The construction of a separating wall, complemented by military checkpoints deployed across these territories, further complicate the matter considerably. The operation of these institutions is entirely under a very complicated regime of control and surveillance that I'm not going to go into because of time limitations. Suffice it to say that as late as November 2017, at least half of the foreign faculty members employed by Palestinian higher education institutions received notice that their residency visas will not be extended, and their spouses were required to guarantee by paying fees that they will not work during the time their husbands will be employed. So in that sense, what I'm trying to say is to show, through the case of the Palestinian higher education system, a sheer plain impact of a kind of classical colonialism of military control and human surveillance, and the fact that it still is the case for these institutions to experience that form of regime. But I want to push further. I want to talk about how did Israeli university and the bodies that represent them, and I'm talking about Israeli universities as organizations. I am not referring now to specific people who might have, or faculty members or professors who might have different opinions on the matter of different positions. But I reckon that the history of collaboration between Israeli institutions of higher learning and with the Israeli occupation apparatuses and with the military in general still awaits to be researched. At this point in time, however, suffice it to say that Israeli higher education institutions as organizations have avoided confrontation with the state, with the Israeli state, on matters pertaining to occupation because they are perceived as controversial and political. Yet, despite such a posture, Israeli higher education institutions have not escaped the Israeli state's wrath neither. Neoliberalization and privatization policies introduced in Israel since the 1990s, accompanied by an increasingly right-wing leaning succession of governments and general elections, submitted Israeli higher education to aggressive policies of domestication. either directly by the state or by right-wing think tanks who consider the denizens of these universities as left-leaning elites that need to be fought. Over the years, these policies included, among other things, a reconfiguration of the composition of the Israeli Council of Higher Education, changes in the financial grants to these institutions, the more recent introduction of an ethical code of conduct that defines and limits academic freedom within classrooms and beyond, the creation of an Israeli Council, and this is interesting, the creation of an Israeli Council for Higher Education Institutions that operate in the Israeli settlement in the West Bank, which is technically and legally outside the state of Israel. And more recently, the introduction or the proposal of a law that is being currently debated regarding loyalty in culture, which means that no funding will be granted to institutions where cultural production and cultural knowledge contradicts established ideologies of the state. My conclusion of all this first point is to show that if Palestinian higher education institutions continue to operate under the grip of direct Israeli colonial rule, limiting their development and growth, their Israeli counterparts succumb more forcefully to the coloniality of power of market-driven capitalist and performative neoliberal policies. In that sense, despite significant differences between the higher education system in both contexts, Palestinian and Israeli, despite these differences, despite significant differences between these two higher education systems, I would argue that both have been and continue to be, each in their own contexts, affected by the totalizing effects of either direct colonialism as pertaining to the Palestinians, and at the same time by the effects of the coloniality of power, different source I will develop later, that operates even more rigorously to generate the alignment of Israeli higher education institutions with the Israeli state's ideology and politics. This predicament of both systems bears a sad testimony to missed opportunity of coalition building and solidarity. I now would like to move a little bit specifically to the context of Palestinian higher education institutions. And I would like to look at how interlocking systems of power that operate within these institutions further amplify the effects of Israeli colonialism. So interlocking systems of power operating within Palestinian society further complicate, amplify, or mediate the implication of colonialism on the operation of Palestinian higher education institutions. From the 50 currently working 50 Palestinian post-secondary institutions of different kinds, with about 220,000 students, one notices a few statistics of interest to my argument. First, that 2/3 of the students, particularly undergraduate students, are female. More than 2/3 are women. But at the level of the faculty members, about 7,000 faculty members working in all these institutions, just 1/4, less than 25, in fact 23-point-something% are women. Women are rather more forcefully employed within the K-12 education systems, in which they represent almost 2/3 of all teachers in public and non-public schools combined. Similarly, women are underrepresented in doctoral programs and in research-related activities in virtually all fields of expertise. This gender division of labor is indicative of the marginalization of women in knowledge generation. Women have only limited opportunity to bring their lived experiences to bear on the kind of knowledge generated in these universities. Yet, in addition, the coloniality of gender is not the only kind of coloniality that operates within these institutions. In addition, geographic distinctions, social class distinctions, intersect with access to higher education institutions and to filling out leadership positions in them. That means that not all regions in the Palestinian territories, within the Gaza Strip and within the West Bank, and not all social classes, definitely not refugees who live in the West, in the refugees, are equally positioned to access higher education and contribute to their operation. So despite having been founded as grassroots organizations, tied to a wider movement geared towards self-determination, Palestinian higher education institutions have remained deeply entrenched in the wider stratification of Palestinian society, its patriarchal power relation, and its spatial exclusivity, and particularly the distinctions between urban and rural communities. And that second point I'm trying to capture as its own combination, as its own effects on the difficulties faced by institutions. And I think now that I move into the third and final point about the geopolitics of knowledge, I will try to bring these two previous points to converge on the main argument I'm trying to make. Palestinian higher education institutions operate as heavily mainstream institutions, and the more so with the expansion of rankings across the world, the assessment of the efficiency and quality of teaching in different institutions. Palestinian higher education institutions have become more concerned with responding to the labels or the description of categories, what is a good university, than anything else. As a result, Professor Ibrahim Mazawi, for example, a social psychologist from Birzeit University on the West Bank, states, and this is quite an important statement in his study, despite their anti-colonial inception and self-nomination as key players in the national liberation movement, Palestinian universities, however, resemble many of their sister institutions throughout the Arab world in their failure to emancipate education, psychology, and other fields from its colonial past. Palestinian universities continue to teach mainstream Western and individualistic knowledge and fail to place development of higher education within its anti-colonial historical context. And he gives multiple examples to that. Secondly, after 1994, with the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, as I mentioned, a body was created to organize Palestinian higher education institutions. And I've been involved a little bit in activities on that side, particularly after 1994, basically from the mid-1990s onward. One of the biggest challenges pertaining to research, especially in education and psychology, was how to reconstitute the fabric of relationship between research in the universities and praxis or practice of different professions in the field. Teachers, educators, community centers, psychologists, and so forth. As you may imagine, before the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, all schools were subject to military regulation. So there was not really a freedom for researchers to go and do empirical research in the schools or anywhere else. And that became one of the main challenges to think through the power relations that have tampered with that disconnect between research and practice. The third challenge that these Palestinian universities encounter in terms of the geopolitics of knowledge is the overwhelming presence of development and international aid organizations or of NGOs that actually work funded constantly by international organizations. The reason I'm saying this means that Palestinians within that global process have no control over research agendas, because normally international aid, government relations, and even development plans are all dictated by funding regulations coming from outside, from international bodies, from agencies like USAID or of other countries. And they will normally put the money exactly where they would like to see things happen. And that will not always, if any, coincide with internal priorities of Palestinian society. And that also creates a situation in which knowledge generation is itself colonized by globalized structures and by the funding that goes with it. And so, given the context I have tried to describe, the Israeli occupation on the one hand, the disconnect between Israeli and Palestinian universities on the other hand, the internal power structures that operate within the Palestinian society on the other hand, the interlocking colonialities of power internally, and finally the geopolitics of knowledge within which Palestinians have no direct control over research agendas. It is very important to ask oneself, how does one engage decolonial work? For once, for one thing, clearly, colonialism and coloniality operate both concurrently. So how would you navigate the different kind of contradictions and ambivalences that operate at this interface? Secondly, one of the major aspects, and especially an aspect that has been discussed at length by Professor Mazawi from Buseck University, is how also to decolonize one's own training as faculty members. Particularly that most of the Palestinians have been actually educated and trained in institutions beyond the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So many of them either in Arab universities, but also in American, British, and Canadian universities. And here it is very interesting, and I would finish with that, to point out precisely what Franz Fanon has written about the fact how the dissemination of a particularly of knowledge that comes already from the colonial centers itself becomes an alienating power or an alienating force within the colonized society. And finally, with regard to the attempts to open up ways to rethink one's knowledge, very much along the way that Vanessa Andreotti has just spoken about. I'm reminded here of Derek Gregory's concept of the colonial present, and with which I will end. And I'm quoting him from the book by the same title, The Colonial Present. He says, with regard to the violence of colonialism, the violence that I've talked about in the first place, but he says something in addition. We also forget the exactions, suppressions, and complicities that colonialism forced upon the peoples it subjugated, and the way it withdraws from them the right to make their own history, ensuring that they did so emphatically not under conditions of their own choosing. We forget that it is often ordinary people who do such awful, extraordinary things, and so foreclose the possibility that in similar circumstances, most of us would, in all likelihood, have done much of the same. To acknowledge this is not to protect our predecessors, or to say, I will add in my own words, to belittle the responsibility of Israeli colonization. Is not to protect our predecessors from criticism. It is to recall the part that we are called to play and continue to play in the performance of the colonial presence. So Gregory's argument highlights the precariousness of any decolonization project, but it also highlights the importance of capturing the specific context of decolonial work, and that decolonial work cannot be a blanket kind of argument to be deployed in all kinds of contexts. And Gregory's work highlights the challenges associated with re-inhabiting decolonized architecture. Some may argue that Palestinian higher education institutions are a kind of decolonized spaces. But how do we, as scholars, researchers, students, administrators, and so policymakers, how do we re-inhabit the architecture of these decolonized spaces becomes a major challenge of decolonial work, while the act of re-inhabiting opens up horizons of possibility, which were hitherto barred by the colonizer. It still runs the risk of perpetuating a colonial present in the guise of nostalgic histories of colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. And thanks everybody who's lasted the whole event. I think we're moving now from Vanessa's very sweeping, very interesting theoretical take on how we even conceptualize knowledge and knowledge production, to Andre's sort of more concrete ideas about how does that play out in decolonization at the university, to what I would now consider even more fine-grained. I'm simply going to give you 2 case studies with actual bodies to say how do we talk about this. And I'll start by confessing, and I'll read the paper, I promise I won't be too boring. I'll start by confessing that this is largely based on the talk I gave at the 2018 American Educational Researchers Association conference, the Division G Vice Presidential Session, an invited session, which was on subaltern speech, academic freedom, and reconstruction of the public sphere. And there were panelists representing the US, Australia, UK, and myself representing Canada. So in this essay, I'm taking my cue from Stuart Hall in being unabashedly autobiographical. From the transplanted South Africans Jane and John Kamarov in a rejection of the taken for granted idea of knowledge production and theory exclusively emanating from and flowing from the global north to the global south, and from recent developments to work with an always already troubled or at least multiplied conception of the public sphere. In conventional thought, the autobiographical carries the danger of slipping into being misguidedly authoritative. But as Stuart Hall once declared paradoxically, quote, "In order not to be authoritative, I've got to speak autobiographically," end quote. I will admit a strong preference for what Ngugi wa Thiong'o, rejecting the equation of dense language with complexity, profundity, and transformational impact, has called poor theory. And I endorse a related conceptualization in Kamarov and Kamarov's call for a rethinking of theory work as a kind of praxis. And finally, the distinctly modernist Western concept of the public sphere, even in Habermas's famous 1960s critique of its renewed insertion of problematic hierarchization, or Nancy Fraser's feminist take on it, is one I want to engage with some ambivalence, encouraged by the proliferation of its forms, including social media as public sphere on the one hand, and suspicious of and frustrated on the other hand by the perennial presence in different guises of manipulation, control, hierarchy, and block power that make the ideal public sphere as level playing field discursive space continuously elusive and deferred. With that as my working frame, I will be speaking in this essay to my necessarily peripheral encounters of two divergent cases, which to my mind illustrate the desperate precarity on the one hand and the delirious effectivity on the other of the representation and social justice engaged praxis and activism of youth in the academy. An academy I insist on reconceptualizing as part of the public sphere. My first example is the very specific case of what I want to characterize as the chain disciplining of an MA student and teaching assistant, Lindsay Shepherd, and her faculty supervisors, Drs. Nathan Rambukana and Herbert Pinlott at the Department of Communication Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. Some of you, or most of you, would know this story. My focus is not so much on the details of this specific example as it is on how it acts as canary in the coal mine of the Canadian Academy, as harbinger of the fate of identity politics and social justice and representation work in the Academy, and how the always already particularly minoritized and marginalized student teaching assistants, the female and transgender, the racialized, the indigenous, the queer, those who dare to take difference and social justice seriously, are neglected in and made to bear the brunt of the sanitized discourses of academic freedom and free speech. My second example is the astoundingly successful case of what Shepard Mpofu has identified as disruption as a communicative strategy of the Fallist student movement in South Africa. I will examine the Fallist movement in general, fleshed out with how it played out specifically, not at the literally shit-disturbing Rhodes Must Fall origin at University of Cape Town, nor the more general hashtag patriarchy must fall and hashtag fees must fall level that followed, but at the place where I encountered it, namely the University of Johannesburg, and its hashtag Occupy UJ and hashtag outsourcing must fall Fallist projects for specificity. Now, when Zeus Leonardo invited me to participate on the AERA panel on subaltern voices on the public sphere, I was recently returned from a 2-month stint as Carnegie African Diaspora Fellow at the University of Johannesburg, where I had been particularly struck by, indeed completely shocked at, the heady success of student activism that meant that student demands, which included the decolonization/Africanization of the university and its curriculum and the provision of free tertiary education, had become the inescapable and pervasive agenda that South Africa's government and universities were scrambling to make manifest. And even as I wrote to accept Zeus's invitation, the case of the chain disciplining of Shepard and her faculty supervisors, which had been taken up well beyond Wilfrid Laurier University into the mainstream media and hence the public sphere, was belatedly taken up in that much more restricted, exclusive corner of the public sphere that is the online academic discussion group, namely the Canadian Association of Cultural Studies Distribution List, or the CACS list. With these two very different examples swirling in my mind at the time, it is perhaps understandable that I proposed to make sense of them in my contribution, to the best I could, to my contribution to the AERA panel, and I'm now subjecting you to that ongoing process of meaning making. What is the context of the representation of racialized and minoritized folks in the Canadian Academy, in which what I am calling the chain disciplining of Shepard and her faculty supervisors, one of whom is a queer man of color, takes place? Frankly, it has been and remains distinctly grim. Frances Henry et al.'s essay published just last year captures well that disturbing, dispiriting, succinct picture, one that you might recognize. And here's what they say, and it's worth quoting them. This article is based on data from a 4-year national study of racialization and indigeneity at Canadian universities. Its main conclusion is that whether one examines representation in terms of numbers of racialized and indigenous faculty members and their positioning within the system, their earned income as compared to white faculty, their daily life experiences within the university as workplace, or interactions with colleagues and students, the results are more or less the same. Racialized and indigenous faculty and the disciplines or areas of their expertise are, on the whole, low in numbers and even lower in terms of power, prestige, influence within the university, end quote. It is hardly surprising that in such a context, advocacy for both academic freedom and freedom of expression on campus have morphed from the always impossible mutual securing of freedom to explore and teach topics and issues of one's choice and expression of a wide range of ideas by all, into a defense of a discourse of racist, homophobic, and more recently transphobic discourse, sometimes thinly veiled as research and in academic language. This is academic freedom as freedom to attack minoritized group, freedom of speech as freedom to offend. Without knowledge of course instructor Dr. Nathan Rambukana, teaching assistant Jennifer Shepard introduced to Communication Studies 101 class a clip of University of Toronto psychology professor Jordan Peterson deriding the use of gender neutral pronouns. The details of the repercussions and reactions are far too many and convoluted to list, let alone explore here. Suffice it to say, the matter spilled over from the Ivory Tower into the supposed public sphere proper when it was taken up by news outlets from Now Magazine to the Globe and Mail. No need to drag the Academy into the dirty outside world, as Stuart Hall recommended in the 1980s. The dirty outside world now easily scales the walls of and readily comments on the goings-on in the Ivory Tower. What interests me in particular is the difference that difference makes in how academic freedom and free speech played out in this case. Ms. Shepard was called on the carpet and roundly reprimanded by the course instructor and a colleague. One has to cringe at the image of two male professors haranguing a young female MA student teaching assistant. And was she merely wrong to have introduced this controversial material? As one contributor to the online debate asked pointedly, what about Ms. Shepard's academic freedom? It would appear that few tenured and tenure-track academics who are up in arms about their freedom their academic freedom, have thought of the possibility that lowly TAs ought to be seen as having that freedom too. But Miss Shepherd, as a confident young white woman, was hardly without agency. She took the matter up with the university, which was forced to issue her an apology about the way she had been treated. Wittingly or unwittingly, she became a darling of the Canadian alt-right. As one newspaper opinion piece put it, alt-right's new hero on campus bullies Laurier into an apology. In fact, it quickly emerged that it was the instructors of record, one of whom has been identified as a queer man of color, who were in a precarious position, as under pressure, the university issued an apology which placed blame squarely on the instructor. On the CAC's list, initial contributions were about defining and historicizing the very concept of academic freedom. It took the outraged intervention of indigenous, queer, and people of color scholars to turn the conversation to, and a reminder that identity matters and difference can have grave material consequences, and that cultural studies is or ought to be about praxis. Eve Top summarized the matter thus, quote, "Actual careers," Nathan is untenured, "and lives are at stake as regular threats of violence have become the reality for members involved in this incident. I'm wondering about the state of cultural studies in Canada when we can so easily abstract the political stakes from the question of academic freedom, academic responsibility, freedom from discrimination and violence. The stakes of academic freedom only become visible when it is tested in these kinds of critical incidents," end quote. And as for the students in Communications 101, it is unclear whether any of them made a formal complaint about Jennifer Shepherd. And of course, they would be damned if they did, and damned if they did not. The lazy school of youth studies labels every generation of youth negatively, presumably against some fictitious and impossible better preceding generation, while progressive academics and youth activists themselves, on the other hand, are always at pains to assert that youth are in fact politically engaged. So if the students did file a complaint, a formal complaint, that would be taken as proof that they are in fact the cuddled generation incapable of facing controversial views. If they did not file a complaint, then they are indeed representative of the feckless, superficial generation that cannot be bothered to get engaged. In a reversal of the taken for granted flow of theory and models of activist practice from the global north to global south, one would need to turn from my Canadian example to my South African example, and an alternative picture of academic freedom and the public sphere. From lamentations about the alt-right abuse of academic freedom for oppression of the minoritized, to a seizing and reconceptualization of academic freedom for the empowerment of the previously dispossessed, from the disempowerment and precarity of students in general and white privilege-tinged individual agency of Shepherd, to collective Black Africanicity as student leadership of the very agenda of the nation's universities. The university everywhere was originally conceptualized to be occupied by the elite, and in Western countries like Canada, that meant straight, white, middle, and upper class males. Certain bodies, brown, black, indigenous, queer, female, transgender, disabled, were and indeed still are in effect bodies out of place in the university. The fact that universities need equity and inclusion offices, and more personally, the fact that I serve at UBC on something called the Vice Presidential Strategic Implementation Committee for Equity and Diversity, and a chair of that committee's working group on race and leadership, are testament to this fact. While in much of the West, racial normativity means that whiteness has not needed to admit itself as constituting the supposed rightful and natural makeup of the university, and thus has needed to be named as hegemonic history and indeed contemporary university culture. In South Africa, tertiary education was explicitly regionally and ethno-racially named, which in effect meant an explicitly racial university system. South Africa's best universities were, of course, white universities, and they only recently started to accept students of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, a reality that makes the post-apartheid so-called born-free, predominantly black youth takeover of the academic agenda all the more astounding. While I was prepared to give one presentation on decolonization of the university as part of my work as Carnegie African Diaspora Fellow at the Department of Communication at the University of Johannesburg, I was unprepared for decolonization talk becoming the insistent recurrent theme of my work. After giving my paper, the department invited me to co-lead one of the workshops of their week-long research methodology they were giving for their graduate students, and insisted that my session be on decolonizing methodology. The Faculty of Education at nearby University of Witwatersrand invited me to give a talk, and my proposal for a presentation on multicultural education and its alternatives was dismissed with an insistence that I address decolonizing the curriculum. And so tongue-in-cheek, I gave this as my title, Decolonizing the Curriculum. I don't think you're ready for this jelly. And I addressed the theme of decolonization. Indication of student agency was reflected in the fact that after sending a representative to interview me extensively, in essence to vet whether my politics were adequately radical, the graduate students of architecture and design invited me to present at their own student-organized and exclusively student-attended session with me on the theme of students' role in decolonizing and Africanizing the university. I had in effect become caught up in South Africa's university's scramble to meet students' demands for the decolonization and Africanization of the university. What that meant in terms of curriculum content and change was in process of being articulated. The picture I was able to put together, and I admit this is as a very peripheral person, was one in which administration and indeed many faculty were not conversant with the notion of decolonization, let alone how to implement it. And students were drawing almost exclusively on the work of Steve Biko and Frantz Fanon for the theoretical and political foundation of this work. While I expected ignorance maybe of Canadians like Eve Talk on decolonization, I was somewhat taken aback that the Latin American decolonization movement and Walter Minolio on epistemic disobedience, or Africans like Samir Amin on delinking, Ngugi wa Thiong'o on decolonizing the mind, Freire on conscientization and learning to read the word and the world, and Mariam Abba and Ama-Ata Aidu on African womanist literature and educational reform were apparently not generally well known by many of the students. Not well known and not made to inform decolonization work. While success of youth activism in South Africa served as an interesting illustration of praxis from the South, which could be useful for the North, I was also struck by the dire need to reorient from North-South conceptions of the flow of knowledge production to the engendering of more South-South flow. The hashtags that have been used to name student activism and the fallist movement, hashtag roads must fall, hashtag fees must fall, hashtag patriarchy must fall, give clear indication that though some of them in fields like communication studies might have, South African students in general did not need to read theory from the North to identify the internet as the new public sphere. In fact, their work broke down barriers between the academy and the streets, and they protested in both locations, mostly black working class youth, bodies that did not belong, fulfilling Stuart Hall's longing to bring the dirty outside world into the university. Exemplary of this was the University of Johannesburg's hashtag outsourcing must fall, which involves students' identification with cleaners, gardeners, and cooks on campus, who were in fact their relatives and neighbors in their working class and poor neighborhoods, and the insistence that the university directly employ campus workers and pay them a living wage rather than outsourcing their labor to companies which they characterize as exploitative and abusive. And paradoxically, academic freedom became most interestingly manifest when the universities closed down during student protests. Students at UJ, for example, sometimes with the aid of supportive progressive faculty, organized, taught, and took classes and even entire courses on traditional academic subjects, as well as topics such as political organizing. All of these exciting developments had to come to an end, of course, and part of the return to normalcy has included incredible levels of securitization by the University of Johannesburg, an effort to reaffirm the ivory tower, to make the university once more a restricted and exclusive space. The politics of difference plays an inordinate role in academic culture, but has been largely evacuated from the nominal conception of notions of academic freedom and freedom of expression in the university setting. Similarly, the public sphere continues to be a floating signifier with new conceptions such as the internet, cyberspace, and social media proving new locales that multiply it, while individualism and influence of the powerful continue to make its ideal elusive. The larger project for me is not academic freedom in and of itself, important as that is, nor is it where the public sphere could be said to reside and how to make and remake a better version of it. And it is not the project of decolonizing the university as an end in itself. Rather, all of these are part of the struggle to answer that larger question posed by Zygmunt Bauman, namely how, with representation, equity, and justice, are we to live together in a full world. Thanks. Okay, so maybe their thoughts. Is André still with us?
Yeah.
Vanessa, do you want to come up and we can do a your panelist kind of thing?
Okay, thank you.
Ah, there he is. Okay. Yes, the chairman.
Thanks to all of you for your very nice and thoughtful presentations. I wanted to ask Vanessa a question which may or may not take what we are doing a bit further in a different direction. It has to do with concepts. In talking about the house modernity built, you gave us a number of concepts. And even before then, there were all these concepts, I like that because it emphasizes the importance of concepts in the whole trajectory of colonization, first of all, and sustenance of the legacies of colonization. Now, the question for me is this. What happens when concepts implode? In the experience of European Enlightenment, there was this struggle to reformulate, so to speak, religiously founded justifications for different things. So Imago Dei, which was the foundation in Christianity for the understanding of human dignity, was reinterpreted, so to speak, and given a different name, human right or whatever. And so we have all kinds of, should I say, desacralization of religious languages so as to recover certain concepts that are important. Now, what happens when the conceptual resources of Decolonize implodes? How do we remake that in order to realize the goals you are proposing? Is that possible?
I think part of this is a very interesting question that we're wrestling with inside the project as well. And one of the responses, there are many, is that conceptualization has been the ground, it's very much part of the ontological ground of how we have been socialized into the world, into finding a definition, finding a concept, allocating will and morality accordingly, and going on with that, with a narrative. But nowadays, this is not different probably from other periods of history where information was not so readily available or fragmented. This is not commanding anymore. So concepts are imploding everywhere, right? People are not after they're after consumption of concepts, as they are after consumption of relationships, consumption of experiences. And that's why I think this is one of the reasons why concepts implode or explode in that sense, because they don't command the level of consensus or the level of motivation they used to command before. On the other hand, if we think about other ontologies and other possibilities of other kinds of relationships to concepts, and possibilities that being cannot be, being is an excess of the concepts. The practices that we engender out of decolonization can take us beyond the collapse of the concept. Because the concept is a story we tell about something in the world, and we have a relationship with that story. Sometimes we want that story to be indexed in reality. Sometimes the reality is quicker than the story. And if we tune into the practice or to whatever it is that we're doing in terms of relationship, rather than hold on to the meaning of it, if we can tap into existence that is in excess of meaning, maybe we have another ground for ontological security than the one based on knowing, on thinking, or on episteme. So I think that's what we have been working with in the project in terms of creating a kind of language that we're not attached to. So it can be decolonization today, I don't know what it's going to be tomorrow, but it's the practice of it, of beauty, of getting to a point where responsibility is not an intellectual choice. Responsibility is not an allocation of will. The generosity, humility, and compassion, including self-compassion, are not dependent on knowledge, identity, or understanding. This is, I think, the goal of the practice we're trying to do. We want to call it one thing or the other. It will depend on the symbolic things available in each context that we work with, rather than on a signifier that we hold on to.
Yeah, now this was why I was asking the question. Thanks for your answer. I just wanted to mention that perhaps you'll find the work of Suleiman Bashirjan interesting in this regard. He's been working on translation and the way it manifests within the African context, especially as both an opportunistic kind of thing, in the sense that when you read, for instance, Chinua Achebe, the translators for the Europeans that came, the colonizing powers that came to places in Africa, the local translators, in saying what the white man, so-called, wanted, added their own share. So they say you should bring $50, then they make it 60 or 65, and all kinds of things that go with that. And also, what I find interesting in his work is how translation leads to reconceptualization, recreation, and all those kind of things. So
thank you for that. I had forgotten it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great to see you, André. I hope you're enjoying your stay. This is Naila. It's not, I think it's a comment and at the same time question, and maybe also it's a kind of reflection that I have been engaging with. Particularly when we are looking at ourselves here on this kind of colonial context where we are working and enjoying a certain privilege that comes even as racialized bodies here. what do you think of how academia is still absorbed by the colonial concept and colonial structures, to the point that we ourselves, the racialized bodies navigating here, coming from the global south, residing here and working here, we adjust and we accommodate ourselves and our, knowledge to the existing knowledge that is governing us. And this is one example of how we, let's say for example about why is English the first language of publication, if you publish in other languages, it's not going to really look nice and decent on your CV. This is one of the things. Tenure, how people are given tenure. What kind of projects are looking at, especially that Handel, you talked about the public, engaging with the public as decolonial project has to start with that grassroots efforts. Another thing from André's presentation, because this is not only the case of Palestine, but this is also the case of most of the Arab countries, that we are trying to reproduce and replicate a certain Western academic vision. And that's why we have people like in certain countries, the Arab countries, they only hire people who are Western educated and who publish in Western journals, given, even though their students are Arabic speaking, their language of instruction is English. So I think we have a deeper question that we need to ask ourselves. What is our position here and our power as racialized academics in disturbing that norms? Is it possible? I see it sometimes very pessimistic, but is there options? Is that what horizons you're talking about, Vanessa? What options we can adopt here as we are still ourselves part of that mechanisms that is excluding any other type of knowledge, but the Eurocentric Western knowledge on these territories? Is there hope for real decoloniality, decolonization? I'm really struggling with that question.
It's a very big question. It's a really good point. I don't know, André, do you want to speak to that, or shall I start off? And
yeah, I will try. Yeah, I think this is what I was. We didn't have time. I mean, for 20 minutes, and then to speak to yourself to the screen is a little bit an experience I haven't had before. So I hope I got it right anyway. But what I was trying to say is that I think that the fact that we put an emphasis just on having institutions like universities, and I'm speaking more specifically, not just even about the Palestinian situation or context, but even many of the countries across the Arab region, certainly in countries in North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, for sure. I think the expansion of higher education is one thing, but on what premises has this expansion happened is a completely different question. And I'm afraid that that second question has not been really adequately thought through and answered. In a sense, universities were seen as if they were capsules which, on their own terms and in themselves, are mediators of independence, of decolonizing, etc. Whereas the internal structures have not been necessarily rethought. In Palestinian society, it is the same situation. And as I was trying to argue, that this coloniality of knowledge, part of it rooted in the reproduction of simulacra of universities, it amplifies the effects of colonization on two counts. It amplifies the dependency of Palestinian universities on mythologies of modernization from the Israeli universities. And secondly, within an international global context, where the attributes of a university are increasingly more stringently defined about what a good university is. Think about the ranking and the work of our colleague Michel Stack. many of the Palestinian universities have bought into it. I think not directly realizing that that kind of coloniality further amplifies the marginality of Palestinian higher education institutions and their dependency on knowledge that does not fit, does not stick, does not speak to local communities. And so I think that there is still a long way to engage the question of decolonizing, particularly in contexts like the Palestinian context, to engage that concept of decolonizing, but the task is so enormous and involves completely different layers and layers, not just of coloniality, but even material colonization, dispossession, evictions, military rule, etc., that it's very difficult for many people, including myself, to think through the issues in an orderly way, given the contradictions that are involved at each one of these junctures. And so I think in many ways, these kinds of institutions are trapped and locked in a predicament which is not very easy to disentangle, precisely because of the fact that it requires thinking beyond the colonial situation into one's implication in reproducing it, as I was trying to say, by drawing on Derek Gregory's notion of the colonial present, that itself is a challenge that stands in itself.
So, I mean, you've asked something very complex, and here's several ways that I would talk about. I don't have an answer. The first thing I would say is, I don't have a there that you want to level against the Western university that we're now complicit with. In other words, I don't think there's an innocent, authentic African culture that I can bring here. Because all those cultures were already mixed in various ways, right? The very fact that I am here, I had to master English. That's why I just wrote a few things as you spoke. Marlene Nobesi Phillips spoke of English. She's from the Caribbean, right? Black woman, black poet. English is a foreign language. English is a foreign anguish. But she has no other language, right? Because she has lost her language. There's another book, Come Back to Me, My Language, right? So she cannot claim as a black woman, say, here's my authentic, I as a Creole person, I'm actually descended from people who might have come back from Jamaica or from Nova Scotia, and I'm African. So where is my authentic, and even when you go to the Igbos, they have been intermixing. I am afraid of notions of cultural authenticity. So first of all, there's no there to begin with. And I don't know how useful it is to unlearn all of what I already know. So we have to work with the idea that we're not coming with something pure, something innocent, something wonderful that is going to transplant. And then you have the whole project of how do you undermine, I think we do little skirmishes. That's what I do. So like the title of my paper, when people said speak to Decolonize, I said, I don't think you're ready for this journey. And I read the title, and all the professors were looking at me, and some of the students were snickering. Some people get it, some people don't. I mean, you have to know popular culture, you have to know who Beyonce is for you to even get the joke, right? And it's at a formal talk, right? So it's little things like that. One of my colleagues, when I was a student at OIC, once said, I'm going to write, was so mad. I'm going to write a paper, believe me, it's going to be all black authors. I'm tired of this. Every day Foucault, this, what. It's going to be nothing but black authors. And he was mad. We were in the office, we were PhD students. And I said, yeah, but who's going to read it? You're going to submit this to somebody who hardly knows, they know few names. Maybe in Ngugi, they might have heard of Wole Soyinka, but all these other people you want to quote, they don't know them. So the project of legitimization, there's the project of of your facility is what even gives you credibility. Right? If you say, my knowledge is embodied, as somebody said, how do you make that kind of knowledge legitimate? It's quite an uphill battle. So I don't think it's a straightforward thing. I think it's pot shots. I think it's the remaking of language sometimes. Like in reggae, Rastafarians take words from English and they do something else with it. In pidgin English, Chela and I were speaking, you take certain words, you introduce other words, you have repetitions, and colonialism has also taught us other things. We kill each other when we write each other. I would write Chief the Honorable Doctor, because you're supposed to garner all these degrees and accolades in order to be somebody, right? It's bad there, it's even worse here. How can you be? So as my father taught me, you have just know as a beginning premise of all the work that you're doing, you're going to have to be twice as good to get half as far. That's the premise of your work. That's it. So we have to deal with all of those things. There are ways of taking pot shots at the system, but I think there was an essay that said if you really want to indigenize the Canadian university, the university cannot stand as it is. It's not a matter of adding courses. You would have to rethink the very idea of the university, right? Which how many people are willing to do? How many universities are willing to say, you know what, we are completely Eurocentric, so we're going to start from scratch. That's what it would mean. And even when you start from scratch, you haven't even thought of what the new problems are going to be. In South Africa, I have people, why aren't we learning things in Zulu? Well, what about the other languages? So how many languages are you going to teach in? I went to one university, they said this was a very, Boer kind of place. We want science in English here, University of the Free State. I said, that sounds good. And somebody else said, at Cape Town, they don't want to know about English. When are we going to make Zulu the official language? I'm like, well then, why only Zulu? Why not this other language? And yeah. And what about your relationship to the rest of Africa? It becomes, the more you begin to unravel it, the more complex the answer becomes to your question. But your question needs to be one that we keep in mind and we ask ourselves, every day, how am I doing today? Am I simply complicit? Am I going along to get along? Or did I find a way today to give it back to the man? Or to undo something in a little way? Or am I giving up something? Or are they overriding me? Or am I now your token for whatever, right? Somebody's coming who's black. Okay, where the black faculty, you need them to be at that event. You know you're a token. Do you play along? When do you say no? These are political decisions you have to make, and I'm being very explicit now, but real politics. And also how to survive. How to survive in the academy. You also have to survive in a profession where everybody is under so much pressure. We have additional pressures. What does it mean to be, a Muslim in the academy today? Do you speak up? Do you not speak up? Here comes Nela, Islamophobia again, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, I think the questions are
Oh, no, it was more a comment, but I was going to say that without identifying his name, and you probably know him, Handel, but for youth and artists that don't have any interest in being a part of the academy, and of course, in their remaking, it's exactly like you said, I don't disagree, you potentially destroy something to re-indigenize or indigenize something, and then you have a whole new set of problems. But one of my fears is around, yes, publications and rankings, that it's the same names attached to big shirk projects, and these models, and this is what you brought up, are then replicated in the South, right, or in Palestine, André, which is what you were talking about, and the power isn't really distributed. And my other question is about hirings, right? I think that there's youth and artists that are very much paying attention, and artist scholars about the coalitions that are formed. So who gets hired, for example, of my generation in positions? are they white faculty members, right? And I think that, for example, there's a faculty member that I quite admire at SFU, and the efforts that he's making to bring in some of the first street dancers with barely a start in grad school, so no typical credentials, and they're the ones that are teaching, right? And they're going through hell, basically, to get these people in there, right? Rather than supporting perhaps the prize student with all the publications. And so I bring that up because people are paying attention. And I'm weary and hesitant, you know, like I feel like I have to accumulate a number of publications to get to a certain point, but I also don't really want them. And so that's what I mean with the paradigm of hostility and refusal, right? And I think that a question for all of you is ego, right? That's coming up in my research, and ego is such a huge thing. I have it, we all have it. So how I've kind of in a way perhaps given up and come to accept that it is just there. So maybe actually giving space for ego, but outside of institutional structures. And so I guess that's a question for everybody, right? How you're all engaging this concept of the ego, whether that's in Palestine, right? So you were saying kind of like actual changes, or in relation to your projects, Vanessa, or Handel, in terms of, you brought up different, very challenging faculty dynamics, right? That's just a big question. Ego seems like the most massive thing.
I think ego is related to several of the questions that we're asking, but also like looking at what nurtures and keeps ego happy is also the sense of worthlessness that we internalize in spaces like this. So for me, I think my own history was, as long as I was trying to change this, that worthlessness was driving, that insecurity, right, was driving what I was doing, but also the dream of seeing something different here. And that didn't take me anywhere, basically. So when I realized that there's work to be done at the interface between the university and what's happening outside of the university, and that is really the work to be done, that the university in a way is an institution that will live and die like other institutions, and that it's not something that I need to be attached to existentially. Then things became much easier, because then I can engage in a battle, not understanding that this is all smoke and mirrors, and understand how to translate things and navigate this environment so that I can support something worthwhile elsewhere. But I don't have to do that as an activist saying, this is what I'm doing, because that defeats the purpose. Then I can't pass as a double agent anymore, right? So I have to do that. And then it's not about me anymore. It's not about my identity anymore. It's not about my morality, like my self-image or what I put on Facebook. It's about actually seeing the work being done, and undermining the parts of me that might have some pleasure in seeing the glamour of this place, or of jet setting, or doing so, but understanding that you're doing that for a reason. You're doing that because you can actually hack the system a little bit to be able to support other projects that are then they are doing the work that is necessary. That might also fail, right? So it's undefined, potentially wiser, but not necessarily. What the people that I work with are thinking about an alternative system of higher education that is not this structure. And they're gonna make mistakes, they're gonna fail. And my job too as the translator is to walk with, or dance with, and breathe with, so that these failures don't go to waste, because the failures are the most productive things actually. It's not arriving somewhere. So how do we shift the way we breathe together so that in hospicing a world that is dying and assisting with the birth of something new, we walk in the eye of the storm. 2 steps ahead, you get caught in the storms. 2 steps behind, you also get caught in the storms. You have to be with the storm itself, and decentering yourself from it, because this is not about you. What we tend to say in the project is that what matters matters when you're no longer in this body, right? So how do we bring that piece of the unknowable and the unknown, but that brings that kind of responsibility back to the table. And how do we nurture that so that the insecurities that sustain the ego can be tempered with something else? As you said, it's always there, but it's also to do with the wolf that you feed. So feeding something different is important.
I would almost turn, I think that question is even more relevant for you than it is for somebody like me. I mean, it's tough for me, but it's even harder for you. Because part of what you said really strikes me as being very interesting. You said something like, okay, well, I need to be publishing, but I don't want to do it. Part of why you don't want to do it is because you are an artist, you're a performer, right? And I'm sorry, but academia doesn't care. So academia is going to say, I want to see your publications, I want to see don't tell me that you're an artist, don't tell me that you perform, don't tell me that you're resistant, I have no time for that. And the fact that you don't have a lot of publications is just proof of exactly what we said. Why are we getting these women of color all the way from Peru to come here to say they're going to do a PhD when in fact they can't cut it? That's how the narrative is going to be read. So we end up, and we do, you end up doing double work. You end up doing that work, right? And in my last essay that I've just written, which is a book we're doing on the nuances of blackness, I said, it's almost like some of us cannot not be academic activists. Well, that's taken a toll on me, right? Because I'm doing my work, but I have to do that other, I almost can't breathe when I'm not doing that other work. But that other work is producing, I feel, so little. It's like, why am I doing this? There are people who just go to the office and think of ideas and write things and publish, and they're perfectly fine. Why can't I do that? Why can't I embrace this identity? I am an academic. Because I've always felt that, that's not you. Come on. Academia, being a professor is a performance, as far as I'm concerned. That's what I've done for 20-something years. I've performed a role. It's not me. But in a way, it becomes you. And if you don't do it well, then you are proof that, and if you do it well, then you become another kind of proof. See, the academy is wonderful. There is Dr. Ochena giving a keynote. He's moved from Germany to South. They invite him to Harvard, and these people want to talk about racism in the academy. See? So that struggle doesn't end. And saying, I'm going to do it differently takes a lot of work and a lot of thinking about what exactly does that mean. Because the moment you say, I'm not going to invest too much in doing this academic stuff, there you go. We told you. Yeah, she didn't cut it. Not that she was also doing this, organizing that. No, we don't want to know about that. When people go up for tenure, this is what I say. All your service work, I did this, no, show me your publications. Number one. So some of us learned that. Some of us have learned to play that game. I can't deny I'm part of this whole structure. I'm not romanticizing myself. I am other things, I hope, than being an academic. But academia is completely unforgiving of your investments in other things. So you are signing up from the beginning for minimum double the work. And that's what I would say to anyone. Just know that that's what you're doing. And the burnout that other people feel, all that stuff, yes, it is multiplied on some bodies rather than on others. It's tough for everybody, but it's much tougher for some bodies than for other bodies. And some of those bodies are here. Miriam.
A very practical question. There's some of us who are working for the university, not at the university, where we're trying very hard to kind of take up this decolonization within the spaces of administration, within faculties. And it's an uphill battle because there's that narrative, but it's all framed within a very colonial structure and kind of colonial underpinnings. And I'm wondering if you have any practical advice as scholars who are engaging with this, as activist scholars who are very much engaging with this work, for those of us who are in the trenches and doing this work of equity and indigeneity within kind of a colonial institution. We're tasked with doing that work.
Put the oxygen mask on yourself.
It's on.
And then help others.
Yeah, I think everybody, no, but that, I mean, I would take that point very seriously. I would have to say self-care is so important. I really mean that. I came to that realization late. Just taking care of yourself, finding room to breathe, allowing yourself room to breathe, valuing your family, being outside, taking yourself outside of the, I mean, I did all the go thing till now it's like, yeah, how big a part of, and the danger of burnout is very, very real. And some kinds of work are harder on one than other kinds of work. If you really are trying to do interventionary work in the academy, if you really care about issues like decolonizing the academy, whatever that means, right? Not as an idea, but the practical work that you do every day. This is hard. This is hard. This is harder than how do we make these numbers work? How do we do this and that and that? But yeah, the idea is not to make it overwhelm one, but also to realize that even in the kind of jobs that you take, we're also perpetuating the system. When somebody says, we now have a committee on equity, and I agree to sit, I realize I am helping this institution do what it, do the work of saying, we are doing the work of equity. See, we even have a working group on race and leadership. And I'm the chair of that, right? How much we're advancing race and leadership at UBC, at this point, after doing it for 2 years, I'm thinking, I don't even know. I'm on sabbatical right now, and part of me is ready to say, I'm coming back, and I don't do any of that anymore. Seriously, it's like how much can you do before you realize, well, in the end, you are a cog in the wheel. Or do you, well, if you're just starting out, you just keep pushing. Change is just around the corner. For those of us who have been doing it for 20-something years, it's like, wow, I've been pounding my head against a brick wall for 20-something years. That's what it feels like sometimes. But I wouldn't want to discourage it because I don't know how to not do this. How do I complacently say, I only need to write these papers, get published, come, teach, go home, and that's it. Who cares if there's underrepresentation of who or whoever? I got my job. I don't know. Maybe I need to reach to a place where I can actually do that in order to survive.
But with the spaces you put in the academia, you allow other people like us to see a different vision. When read Kodila or read Handel or read André or read Vanessa, there is a change within how we perceive as students, how we approach these things. I know that the change would take a lot because these structures have been, these are the structures, these are the foundations, and to shake them a bit, it requires a lot. But I think, as Mariam said, this is a survival cycle, and we need to survive. We need to survive. We have no other choice. So that's why when we say about practical tips, is also creating a sense of solidarity. That is, because sometimes we get into that lonely, depressing environment. We are so excluded, we are so lonely in that struggle. And this kind of solidarity is rarely existing among racialized people, people of color, students of color, teachers of color, as if we are shameful or kind of ashamed to admit that our speciality is also, dictated by our bodies, by our identities, by who we are. So this is the thing that I agree totally with Mariam, that in the kind of practical survival thing is just to create these spaces where solidarity is more pronounced, is more existing, is more, is showing that, yeah, we are here and we are supporting each other in that. And there is no shame in that. It doesn't mean racism, it doesn't mean, we don't like other people, but it means that our structures are so weak and we need to have these foundations quite strong to move on.
I would agree with that.
Just to say, this is such a lovely conversation. Like in some ways, I feel like we are having it in the cracks of the system, and I wish this was 9:30 in the morning and we were just, starting at this point. And to respond to what Mariam was saying in your response, Handel, the metaphor, Vanessa, that you used actually, the motherboard and the app really spoke to me. Like you're trying to change the motherboard, and at some point also said, you're trying to change the neurobiological wiring, which is like kind of even more fundamental than the motherboard. But I think for those of us who are working in the administration and whatever, I think a lot of it is we are trying to change the apps so that you can so that folks like you there could be more of you, that there could be, because like how do you change the motherboard if you're a software, it's just kind of like, it's a different way of intervening that, like whoever created the hardware is not around, like that is not a person, how do you change that? So I feel like, yeah, a lot of the work is creating the app so that we can create the cracks in the system until we change the motherboard, but not to confuse the work of changing the apps for the work of changing the
exactly.
They connect with each other, but they're not the same.
Just a reflection on stance, I'm not facing back to people. A reflection is that throughout this day, which has been fantastic, I have repeatedly heard people refer to Western universities, Western values, Western norms, and reflecting on that, I wanted to share that my people and a lot of people have been on this land for 100,000 years. And in referring to Western, you're referring to what's happening on this land, but you're erasing me and my people and our history, because you're not referring to Cree or Iroquois or Mayan values and structures and systems. You're referring to, I would suggest, European and Eurocentric. And so I would challenge you, when you're speaking, when you're about to say Western, to perhaps instead replace it with a more accurate term like European or Eurocentric, so that we're not engaging in that colonial erasure of the people who have always been on this land. Thank you.
Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Can I make a comment on Handel, what you said, in particular what André commented, and draw on my South African experience about how you actually assert identity in a restrictive, oppressive environment. Let me start with that. André, I'm fully with you when you outline the restraints at Palestinian universities. The South African ethnic universities, which were called bush colleges, were under similar restraints. And I must say, BICO and the Black Consciousness movement had a fantastic strategy to undermine the system from within. What they did, and you reminded me with your dancing today of that, they didn't use dancing or cultural performances, they used humor and theater performances to actually assert exactly initially what the oppressor wanted them to be. The oppressor wanted them to be, to celebrate their culture and their thing. So Biko adopted the name Steve Bantu Biko. Bantu was a derogatory word. And everyone knew when the Black Consciousness movement performed a play, it was a coded play. It was absolutely funny. They used exactly what the oppressor wanted them to be in order to undermine it. And everyone who was with that, in the consciousness, they understood it. And I think if the Palestinian universities were to do it in a similar way, even the Israelis couldn't shut them down or restrict them further. That is one thing. And Handel, I'm fully with you. I would go so far to say, I mean, colonialism is a fact. Is a fact which cannot be decolonized or undone. And you are totally right in the advice, in the practical advice you give. And the question I wanted to ask, or let me put it more provocatively, actually, about decolonizing the university is a waste of time, is a waste of energy. It's a pseudo debate we are leading. I'm coming from a left Marxist tradition. Even Marx knew that already. The steamroller of colonialism will equalize and modify everything. And there was an incident in South Africa recently which was astonishing for me. I would never say that publicly in South Africa. There was the premier of the Western Cape. It's not the National Party woman, it's a woman who was active in the anti-apartheid movement. In one of her emotional states, she made a comment on Twitter that colonialism also had some benefits. Benefits of bringing medicine, benefits of all the technological invention which, despite all the oppression, we should also recognize. And all hell broke loose. She almost had to resign because she insulted those who said we must decolonize, and colonialism was all oppression. In fact, she had destroyed an illusion there in which the majority of the decolonizers live and feel happy. And I think a realism which you elaborated is what is needed. And the self-care and all the other things, that's what humanistic survival means. These apartheid guys, they knew that. They gave money to decolonize. They said, here you have your ethnic universities, Black consciousness. You have a Zulu University, Xhosa University, Venda University. They have 6 Black consciousness universities. And these will be actually, and they are not considered to be top universities, but they will be these progressive centers. Kugler wrote an article about that long time ago in a restrictive environment. So in South Africa, it says la luta continua.
I wouldn't be so defeatist about giving up on changing the project. I mean, I think the point. who's there. I think the point is we still have to chip away at transforming the power holders. I mean, that's where the educational project lies. How do we get those people to be more multilingual, have different frames, have to open up? That's where the educational project lies. We're okay, but I think we've already got 2 or more frames, but many of the power holders are very, very restricted. So I think the South African context is an important one because it shows you how even ethnic practice won't really give you the answer you want. But the situation here in these universities is very different. I mean, there were phases even UBC went through where the president's office tried to open it up. But there were limits. I was in a position where I was the director of one of these things. My own countrymen or people of shall we say, ethnic origins hesitated when I went there to see how they could transform the way they were teaching, because they felt I was undermining their professional skills. That is, they were physicists or they were this. Why am I coming with this multicultural opening up the university to make it more representative? So it's very layered. I mean, it's layered, and a lot of it hinges on who the power holders are, and that area can be broken into. So I'm not really defeatist about letting it go.
It's a pity you don't have one more person. I was agreeing with Harry to some extent, then I was disagreeing, and then you can agree with that more. And but there's still a little thing there, and I wish there was a third person there. But no, but I do take both your points seriously. I would only push even further than you're saying, Kogila, to say, yes, it's important to look at who's in charge in terms of the power structure. But I think even more important, what is the politics of who's in charge? Because when I think of race and leadership at UBC, I think, am I restricting myself to saying there ought to be more indigenous and people of color, in positions of leadership, which I think ought to happen. But if those people are simply going to reproduce UBC as is, right? Or make it even worse than it is, and believe me, all our identity categories have representatives who are more than willing to do that. Then no, I'm not in favor of that kind of. So it's not just the idea of a brown face or an indigenous face or a black face as president or whatever, but actually, are the structures the same? I mean, Vanessa's work, are we able to think even differently of, about how things could be? I mean, I taught a PhD course in which sometimes some things that people come up with really blow you away. You're talking about epistemology paradigms, and indigenous students really were able to take the idea of paradigms and say, well, there are 2 different interventions. One is to say, no, we don't do this way. Here's another paradigm, and don't put it in the critical paradigm, right? Because we refuse to, again, be kind of now brought in under something or other, right? But this is its own paradigm. And I thought that in itself was wonderful, but there were other students who went even further and said, I'm not dealing with this structure at all. This way that knowledge has supposedly been, the way that you're talking about methodology, I refuse. And then I said, I'm not disagreeing with you, but you have to find a way to articulate that, right? Because you can't just say, I opt out. Because academia comes again and says, I'm the one grading this, right? And you have to make an argument for moving out of. You have to know that, which is the double knowledge, the double work, right, that we have to do. If you really want to do something different, then you have to know the thing that exists, and critique it and then put forward. So it's always that double, triple work that we're doing, which sometimes it's worth it. And I would agree with you. I think the university is important. Something is at stake. Academia does big things, important things. I don't want to subscribe to the academia's ivory tower anymore at all. It's another site, it's what Stuart Hall said, it's another site of struggle. Right? So I'm not willing to give up and say, oh, like I'm actually something else, so the university is like, that's its own thing. The real activist work, there's real activist work to be done here, right? Which might, sounds not tautological, but what's like contradictory. But to say you can actually be, and what you think of yourself as an academic activist, which I think is what maybe you are, right? Yeah. So we're almost ending our André, yes, go ahead.
No, I had nothing. I didn't have anything particular to say, but just to perhaps build on some of these points that were raised. I fully understand the fact that we're located within a particular context of higher education. One that is fully integrated into the North American global system, and I think we've spoken about that sufficiently, and I think both Handel and Vanessa captured very important aspects of it. At the same time, at least in my presentation, I was trying also to point out that these rationalities of higher education may not necessarily be playing out the same way in other contexts, where the issues at stake, I would argue, are much more dramatic, much more consequential, and therefore there is a space for which we need to think through how, by our own doing of our own academe, we are creating colonizing models for other people elsewhere. So much colonizing that actually they shut down or they make more difficult local articulations of the university. When I was talking, I was drawing on Mignolo's work on the geopolitics of knowledge, but what I was trying to point at is the fact that dynamics we are implicit in or we are complicit in within Northern American academia are closing down spaces for other forms of being, and that we cannot disconnect ourselves from these consequences. Like what I'm trying to say, I'm not sure I'm capturing this particularly precisely, is that when one listens to what does it mean to be an academic in a particular setting, it is as if the consequences of that form of being are limited and confined to the space in which that person is thinking. What I'm trying to say is that advocating a particular way of being an academe in a particular space, especially when it comes from universities that we frequent, have consequences for how universities elsewhere might be positioned in relation to these kinds of projects. In the Palestinian context, more specifically, even not just there, as I said, this problematic is much wider. Universities paradoxically have become the major barriers to knowledge, paradoxically, because they are more preoccupied, obsessively preoccupied, to reproduce whatever would count as something that would legitimize them, their enterprise, without really opening the spaces for that knowledge to have any particular resonance. For instance, take the political context in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. where for decades people have been completely traumatized by military and by other kind of violent events. Entire generations have been affected by the well-being, mental health consequences of this situation. And what you find are programs and diagnostic approaches that take a basically individualistic North American, European forms of understanding mental well-being and applying it to diagnose and treat people who are living absolutely, completely different forms of subjugation, including in context of excessive material violence on a daily basis. So my question is, what are we doing when we export that kind of knowledge, including among people who we supervise? We all supervise people who come from different places where these issues are of paramount importance. What are we doing? Are we, for example, helping that colonized person accommodate and live with the phenomenon of colonialism? Or are we able even to question our supervisory roles, our research agendas in ways that take into account the fact that responsibilities to decolonization transcend the limits and confines of our own institutions? Like, I appreciate what Handel has said about taking care of oneself, absolutely. And I can see how one would have to navigate a position like Vanessa's and a position like Handel and take into account these things. What I'm trying to say is that increasingly academic realities in which we are living have consequences, even in our local decisions, for people elsewhere, in the way we train education, in the way we educate international students who come to us from these countries or from these societies, in the way we promote a particular kind of vision of research, the kind of methodologies that we would like to support develop. And I think that requires thinking about decolonizing in ways that would be different, just to limit the problematic to questions of race and diversity as we understand them normally in this context, in our context. And I feel that that particular aspect of our work is not always theorized in its implication for decolonial praxis. It's not always the case. It remains almost a blurred or a very kind of muddy terrain where we try to do our best, but there is little reflection on what does it mean for me, being an academic here with people from elsewhere who come to me to get their education. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that decolonizing in that sense, certainly at the level of praxis, is so much multi-layered, so much nested within all kinds of contradictory processes, that building an understanding of decolonial praxis as something that hinges on our understanding of particular context become a very important enterprise to do, or a very important task to attend. And I don't feel that that is the case. We speak a lot in our own university and other universities in Canada about international students, about diversifying the curriculum, etc. But that does not touch on the essence of what does it mean for us to engage decolonial work in a context which is becoming increasingly more saturated with the kind of conflicts that I have indicated. The second and last point, I think I tried to allude to it in my opening remarks. I jumped over some parts of the text. That it seems to me that in thinking decolonial work, both at the level of theory and of praxis, there is so much an emphasis on coloniality, as explained by Quijano, for example, and others, that implicitly one assumes as if the colonial is finished, the colonialism is finished, destroyed. He says it in his article. And that I find difficult because it already this kind of position pushes us to think coloniality in relation to platforms of modernity without really giving importance to the material conditions under which many peoples and communities in the world are still struggling with on a daily basis. The Palestinians being one of them, but not just. And I'm sure that if we review different contexts, there would be hardly a state where minorities have not been captured in this kind of colonialism, or groups have not been captured in this kind of dynamic. And so what I'm saying is that thinking through decolonial praxis, even within the context of North American universities, Canadian universities, requires us to consider the implications of our work also for this context, and how could we just mobilize to be really engaging in decolonial work, not just in the sense of it being limited to our institutional spaces.
Okay. Is that a good word on which to end, or do people still have scintillating points to? This is how I usually end a class. I say, you know, does anybody have a particularly scintillating, earth-shattering, well, I'm going to say something, but I don't know if it's earth-shattering point to make, and then people normally don't volunteer. But you might have an earth-shattering point to make. Yes, I see, I mean, somebody would be brave enough to say, yes, I have a particularly scintillating point to make.
No, I think I want to say thanks to all of you, and thanks especially to you and to Mary and every other person that organizes this.
And thank you everybody for being here. I think this was well worth it, very stimulating and important in many ways. And I hope we can continue these discussions. I hope if you're not signed up and you're interested in the center and its work, that you do sign up with Mary to be informed of center activities. Yeah.
I also have an announcement. There's Alexis Shotwell, who wrote the book Against Purity. She confirmed she's going to be here on the 17th, so I'm bringing her through the CRC. It's going to be in association with Peter Wall as well. So her book is very interesting. She's talking about ethics in compromised times, and it's one of the groups that my collective too has. There's a review on the website actually that gives a very different framework for thinking about effective investments in activism. So she's going to be here talking about that. And then in the beginning of February, we're bringing Danine Emilia, who's an artist, who's Brazilian, who works with this concept of radical tenderness through performance. And we're going to have a 3-day workshop with her, also doing this effective work necessary for us to shift the ways we engage with the system.
Okay.